Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. I am Zsuzsa Csergő, Director of Virtual ESN, Professor of Political Studies at Queen's University in Canada. And I am here to welcome everyone to this very important event, which focuses on Armenian displacement. The conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over sovereignty in the Nagorno-Karabakh region has been a major source of insecurity and uncertainty for generations of people, creating extraordinary challenges for pursuing a good life, even a safe life, let alone the kind of stability and predictability that democratization scholars have been telling us is necessary for a society's ability to create an inclusive political community with inclusive narratives and terms of belonging, which we are told are necessary for commitment to a common future. Vulnerability and resilience are always present in societies, but events of mass population displacement make it extremely difficult for people to find a manageable balance. Even meaningful discourse becomes difficult at times of displacement. And our panel focuses on Armenian displacement, providing context to the ongoing crisis, the flight of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, addressing local and international humanitarian responses. And we are privileged to bring together leading experts, both social scientists and local activists from Armenia, who share our knowledge, our expertise with us. And I would like to express my special thanks to our expert moderator, Dr. Ulrika Ziemer from the University of Winchester, who has helped us to put together such an amazing panel, working together with our own Dr. Lisa Kurichkina at Virtual vASN. Before giving the virtual floor to Dr. Ziemer, whose short bio will be posted in the chat field, I would like to remind our audience that our panelists' short bios will be posted in the chat field as they begin their presentations, and that we welcome your questions throughout the conversation. Please use the Q&A field for that. And we use the chat box only for posting our panelists' bios and sometimes for suggestions for relevant literature. So we welcome your questions and thank you for being here with us. The floor is yours, Dr. Ziemer.
Thank you, Zsuzsa. We couldn't have a more important topic today in terms of that the issue that Armenia is facing at the moment is still ongoing. Lots of people still struggling to find permanent accommodation. So what we have today, and I'm really pleased to say that we have 4 experts in the field who are currently dealing with the situation. There's first Dr. Joe Laycock, who is senior lecturer in migration history at the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures at the University of Manchester. Then we have Knarit Mirtayan, who is the co-founder of Women's Agenda and feminist advocate of women's rights since 2009, directly speaking to us from Armenia. We also have Dr. Gohan Shanasaryan, who is the director of the Gender Studies Institute at Yerevan State University and the co-director of Women's Fund Armenia. And finally, we also have Dr. Lawrence Broers, the co-director of the South Caucasus program at Conciliation Resources. Zsuzsa has already talked about how we continue with this panel, that all questions can be posted in the Q&A sections, and that while everyone is speaking, the biographies of the panelists will appear in the chat line. So I suppose I will hand over to Joe to start to give us little backgrounds on how the history of displacement can echo in the present currently. So fire away, Joe.
Thank you for having me to speak here to you tonight. As you'll see from my bio, I'm a historian and I work on histories of displacement, humanitarian relief, and international intervention in Armenia and elsewhere. I speak tonight as an outsider, really, with the aim of providing some historical background and some contextualization. I will divide my comments into two sections. I'll start by talking about longer-term histories of displacement and resettlement in Armenia and the wider region. I'm then going to move on to talk about responses to forced displacement and histories of refugee relief. So, as I say, I witnessed the events of September 2023 from quite a distance in Manchester, reading accounts of what The Economist described as ethnic cleansing and a humanitarian catastrophe, and watching this seamlessly endless queue of cars as Armenian families fled their homes in what had been the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, in well-founded fear of their lives and their futures. This was not, of course, the first time that Armenians had experienced mass displacement. I was vividly reminded of the primary sources that I'm dealing with in my own research, for example, about the Armenian exodus from Van in summer 1915, when more than 100,000 Armenians fled into what was then the imperial provinces of South Caucasus in order to escape genocidal violence. The genocide of the Armenians was, of course, unique in scale and nature, but it was also part of a longer history of displacement and resettlement, which has shaped the 20th century South Caucasus. Between 1918 and 1920, Armenians and Azerbaijanis were both forcibly displaced, sometimes with great violence, in attempts to carve out national spaces in what had been a multi-ethnic borderland. And this resulted in escalating cycles of violence. Decades later, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Armenians and Azerbaijanis became the object of entwined Soviet resettlement projects, which were designed to build nations and aid post-war development in the two republics. Again, this had consequences that were not foreseen. As the Soviet Union collapsed, the South Caucasus once again became the site of violent displacements, and around 1 million people lost their homes because of the first conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. Many Armenians, but also the greater part of these refugees at that time were Azerbaijanis. So this is not, of course, a matter of keeping a kind of score. These histories are raw, they're painful, and can be really difficult to talk about. You can probably tell now that I find it difficult to discuss this, and I'm sure everybody else here is aware of that too. Memories of these displacements past resonate in the present day, and they can animate new forms of violence. They've been repeatedly instrumentalized by states in attempts to justify contemporary territorial claims, by establishing who can trace a deeper or an exclusive historical presence in the region, so to establish kind of who really belongs. Now, despite this, histories of the cause and context of displacement, I believe, remain important, not to establish which ethnic or national groups have a greater right to a particular bit of land, but because they have the power to unsettle exclusionary national narratives and territorialized visions of national belonging, which have sustained conflict. Yes, histories of displacement in the Caucasus demand an engagement with violence and intolerance, which is uncomfortable, but they can also reveal patterns of coexistence, common experiences, and even cooperation, which existed in this multi-ethnic borderland, and even in some cases into the Soviet period, a region which was long characterized by diversity, by mobility, but these histories tend to be erased at the present, and I appreciate that they are kind of very, they can be difficult to sort of think about at the moment. I also think there's a broader point about the importance of history and about context and specificity, needing to kind of really get to grips with that and not to collapse into this narrative of nation ancient hatreds or intractable conflict, but to really understand the precise circumstances that lead to violence and which lead to displacement. Okay, I will have 10 minutes, so I will try to be brief, but I'll now turn to histories of refugees and of relief. As I said at the start of this talk, this is by no means the first time the territory which now constitutes the Republic of Armenia has experienced the arrival of thousands of refugees. Between 1914 and 1921, the First World War, the Armenian genocide, and the consequences of imperial collapse, so Ottoman and Russian empires, also led to the arrival of hundreds of thousands of refugees in the Caucasus. And this was sometimes a matter of multiple displacements, with people moving back across the border several times. 7 decades later, as an independent Armenian state emerged from the ashes of the Soviet Union, it witnessed the arrival of Armenians forced to flee Azerbaijan in the context of the First Karabakh conflict. More recently, in the context of the Syrian civil war, Armenia has provided, sometimes temporary, but nonetheless a home to displaced Syrian Armenians. Some of those displaced from Karabakh in 2023 have their own personal family experiences of displacement, which are interweaved with these larger historical narratives. And often people understand what is happening to them in contemporary displacements in terms of these longer histories. So in all of the historical examples I have just discussed, the arrival of refugees generated expressions of compassion and care. They revealed solidarities across different social categories and across regional international borders. So we might think here about feminist actions on behalf of refugees, or indeed of the way that the diaspora engages in charity, humanitarianism, philanthropy, and that's something which is understood from the historical perspective. At the same time, the strain that providing for the needs of a displaced population placed on economic and social structures at these times also exacerbated social or political fracture lines. In the aftermath of the First World War, this often manifested as a tension between Eastern and Western Armenians. The arrival of refugees could also expose the limits of national belonging in unexpected ways, as their acceptance could be partial or ambivalent, and in some cases, coming to the national homeland didn't feel like home for refugees. So other scholars have written about how this was sometimes the case with the Armenian refugees who arrived from Azerbaijan in the 90s. And as South Kazarian has shown in her work, such dynamics could have a very gendered dimension, and I'm sure that might chime with some of the things other speakers have to say today. Okay, also common to the episodes of displacement I've talked about above were two kinds of representations of refugees, which were often in tension. First, the image of the refugee as a helpless victim who deserved aid, but was a potential kind of burden for society. At the same time, refugees have frequently been imagined as a kind of resource, as people who can contribute valuable skills or labor for the nation or for society. The latter image may be familiar to some of you from the representation of Syrian Armenians who arrived in the Armenian Republic after about 2011. So we got a lot of accounts of their work opening restaurants and other kinds of businesses in Yerevan. In the 1920s, this was also present, and refugees were regarded by the Soviet authorities in Armenia and Transcaucasia as a kind of valuable source of agricultural labor to contribute to the economic modernization of the South Caucasus. One of these representations, that of refugee as resource, obviously has more positive connotations than the other. However, both can serve to obscure the hopes and needs of refugees themselves, as well as their capacity to shape their own lives. In her work on contracts of protracted displacement in a different part of the South Caucasus, in Georgia, Elizabeth Cullen-Dunn has argued that, and I'm quoting here, the new humanitarian order often presents itself as an extension of the chaos of war, a kind of permanent disruption that renders life unpredictable, leaves people at risk of violence and poverty, and prevents them from making plans for their new lives, end quote. It's important then to ask, amid the urgent interventions and claims made on refugees' behalf by local, international and diasporic actors, what space there is for those displaced by the recent conflict in Karabakh to tell their own stories and make plans for new lives. So I'll just conclude by saying a little about why history might be important at this moment. So it may seem too soon to think about the displacement of Armenians from Karabakh from a historical perspective. Perhaps this is the case, although as I've tried to show in my brief comments here, histories are important for understanding the wider causes and context of displacement. They can help us to think critically about state and humanitarian responses to refugees. But historical approaches matter because, as Peter Gatchell makes clear in his work, history matters profoundly to refugees themselves. It's a means through which they locate themselves temporarily and spatially, make sense of experiences and conceive of their futures. In the case of, so in this case, it's worth thinking about how the experiences of those who've been displaced, forcibly displaced, will be archived or otherwise documented. Who will be given a chance to tell their stories? Who will want to tell their stories? To whom will these stories be told and in what contexts? And to which political and social projects might they be harnessed, emancipatory, reconstructive or otherwise? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. So thank you for providing this very interesting and obviously complex history of displacement in the South Caucasus. I hand over now to Goha, who will tell us a little bit more about the gendered perspective of the current situation of displacement and the recent findings based on the SNAP needs assessment you have conducted via your Women's Fund in Armenia. So.
Thank you very much, Ulrika. Thank you for the invitation and for highlighting this important question, and especially, as you mentioned, gender dimension of any humanitarian crisis and any ethnic cleansing is usually not so much obvious, and very often it's not in any research and any assessments that are done by the humanitarian organizations or the government. As it was mentioned earlier, this ethnic cleansing was fueled by quite a long-standing tension in the region and exacerbated by the blockade of the Lachin corridor that started on December 12th in 2022. The Lachin corridor was closed by Azerbaijani authorities for about 9 months prior to this event that happened in September. So our organization, Women's Fund Armenia, is one of the feminist organizations in Armenia that is also supporting other local initiatives and organizations, especially those working in the regions. And immediately after the more than 100,000 people arrived, we started our own SNAP needs assessment, which was not very easy to organize, of course, but through our partners, we tried to understand also the situation that women, girls, and other vulnerable marginalized groups have now. So overall, the affected population came from more than 16 communities within Nagorno-Karabakh region, and they found themselves completely compelled to flee, with media reporting numerous human rights organizations describing it as one of the largest instances of ethnic cleansing in the region in recent decades. We can understand, of course, that people arrived deeply traumatized and in a very traumatized, devastated state. And among those who arrived, now we already have some estimations by the UN Women and by the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. 52% are women and girls. And the majority came without main sort of a breadwinner, and they are finding themselves in a very new situation that they also have to take the whole responsibility for the families. And because tragically, many, of course, had lost mainly fathers, husbands, or sons. Either they were killed in the recent attack by Azerbaijan or wounded and missing after a very massive gas explosion at a fuel storage facility during the same period. And unfortunately, this is the situation that we found the majority of women who were arriving were. In the initial days of displacement, quite a couple of weeks, the refugees, the displaced population were placed into Syunik region, which is also the region bordering with Azerbaijan right now. And that was an additional trauma also for people. And the majority really didn't want to even stay at that region at that time, because they thought that, they hardly escaped one attack, and they were in the blockade for 9 months, and now they're placed in the quite risky situation once again. And this humanitarian crisis has severe effects on the lives of those affected. Of course, we understand on everybody, but especially women, children, and the elderly were in a very vulnerable situation because of also mental health issues and now when again this rapid assessment of UN women showed that many arrived with quite already chronic mental health also needs. And right now we visited a couple of shelters, and you can see that people clearly express this mental health, emotional quite challenging situation, but they're also continue to live with other family members or with people, a lot of people in the small facilities. And trying to understand the whole situation through gender sensitive approach, and to sort of to use this gender transformative approach to the crisis, it's essential in any type of crisis, and especially in this type of humanitarian catastrophe when people are just rapidly arriving without anything. And that's why I just wanted to stress that how important it is to have women's organizations working on the ground, because for us we understood that we were among few organizations that were providing emergency support to our partners in the region, but not just support in terms of financial support, but this support came with very gender sensitive approach, and I will explain what it means later on. But also to sort of we tried to fill that gap until bigger humanitarian aid will come. And this is very important, and very often we don't really understand and how important it's to have these women's feminist organizations on the ground, because they basically the ones that are providing support and trying to address the needs of vulnerable communities. And just to summarize our data based on our preliminary, very, very SNAP needs assessment, I would like to stress a couple of main issues. This is safety and security concerns that now the majority of women and girls express. And these are, of course, very legitimate concerns. And they face increased risk to their safety in the times of displacement, and they felt very threatened while trying to crossing the border. And many have been separated from their families as well. And we have a couple of cases of women, they couldn't drive, for example, but the majority of their neighbors were just rapidly living by cars. But because they couldn't drive, they were forced to walk hours with their small children, and when they arrived to the border, they were also almost exhausted from all these hours of work. And one family, a woman told us that she was with her teenage daughters, they stayed under the rain for about 5-6 hours. And so, and of course, also there is a fear of violence, including sexual harassment and sexual violence from some of our partners, partner organizations in the regions. We keep hearing that people are already, women are telling them about sexual harassment that happened during this time, basically 48 hours. And then, but we have, this is really an important issue. We have to have quite a good system of fact finding, because sometimes, people just saying that I've heard this story of sexual violence, I've heard this and that, but this is, it requires a very, very thorough fact finding in order to present it as a legitimate and valid report. But also the absence of secure housing and privacy compounds these dangers and fears as well. And most displaced women arriving to Armenia don't even know where to apply in cases of gender-based violence or problems related, for example, to reproductive health. Another big issue that was completely overlooked by other humanitarian organizations or the government, it's a health and hygiene issues that sort of these dignity kits, as we call them in the humanitarian world, as UN invented this dignity. I think it's UN, if I'm not mistaken. So they call dignity kits, including all the necessary things for women's reproductive health and all the hygiene issues, but nobody was even thinking about, of course, in that situation, about those type of products that women and girls might need. It also includes maternal and child health services, and at that moment that were completely absent. But among arrivals, we had a lot of women, pregnant women, and women with serious reproductive health issues. And this lack of hygiene facilities and hygiene products at the moment generally increases risks of infections and other health issues. And now we are investigating that as well. What happened to those who had chronic reproductive health issues and how they're now dealing with the more like a worsening of the situation. Another big concern is an economy, as we can understand, economic vulnerability. And as I mentioned previously, the majority of women, and most of them never really worked outside of their household previously. So they're finding themselves becoming the main breadwinner. And among the displaced community, they really are the ones that are taking care of children, but also they have to take care of financially about the future of their children and basically survival of their family. And it's a very risky economic situation, because we already see that they might be exploited as well, because they are not very well familiar with the legislation of Armenia and in general, with they were, as I said, never been really in the labor market. And also unfamiliar environment in general, including some language issues, cultural issues, etc. And finally, it's of course psychosocial well-being and mental health. It has been mentioned by many organizations already, including our partners in the regions, mentioning that women and girls experiencing profound trauma and distress in this situation, which is obvious. And there are a lot of issues with anxiety, depression, and no coping really mechanisms with this, because just right now some psychologists, social workers starting to work with them, but it's mainly humanitarian support that they are providing, and while that they are also trying to talk to these people, but it's not very well organized and not like long-term psychological support provided. And I also mentioned about reproductive health needs. It's still there. We have to continue thinking through, to think about these issues through gender lenses. because the majority of women have reproductive health issues, and they also need more knowledge on family planning and things like menstrual hygiene management, etc. This is crucial in the facilities also that they're living in, which sometimes they're lacking some also hygiene situations, especially in the shelters that were visited. Yes, and the aid that is provided by the government and or by the humanitarian organizations, it's never enough, of course, as we can understand, and it's never prioritizing those type of needs. It's mainly the clothes, the now warm clothes because the winter is coming, or food, etc. But not overall well-being, or or reproductive health or gender-based violence that also might occur in the shelters that women are placed now. And I also wanted to bring an example of a couple of really devastating examples of women that while collecting this data, we also talked to them, to trying to also understand their profiles and to collect also oral stories from them. And there were stories of women that were lost. For example, one woman, she lost her husband in the war in 90s in Nagorno-Karabakh. She lost her grandson in the war of 2020. And she didn't want to come to Armenia. She was resisting until the very last minute, and she came with the very last bus because she lived with her husband, with her son now. And she said, I was just scared that they will kill my son because I don't have anybody anymore left. And that's why I just decided to come to Armenia. Otherwise, I just wanted to stay there and die. And unfortunately, it's just not one case of a woman. And we can imagine how traumatized this woman is, and how what kind of a long-term support she really needs to get out of this trauma, if she ever could get out of that type of those type of situations. Among arrivals, we also saw that there were people with really from vulnerable communities, and double, triple vulnerabilities. Even there is a group of women living with HIV/AIDS, and these people were completely reliant on Armenian, on the NGOs, civil society organizations, and also on the government in Armenia. But while in this chaotic situation, for example, nobody was thinking about that group. And we supported one organization working with them to provide medical supplies for this group in particular. But there are many, many groups like this that are not just, they have other type of needs and issues. And unfortunately, the humanitarian support is coming. It's not a targeted support. It's very sort of homogeneous support for everybody, without really taking into account these intersectional and gender lenses, which are so important in this type of crises. I think that's it from my side, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you have, or just to continue conversation further if we have time. Thank you.
Thank you, Goha. That was really interesting to hear you all this very sad stories and all the challenges regarding displaced families and women. We have already got a couple of questions in the question and answer section, but before we kind of get into the questions, we still have two more panelists, and I'll pass on to Knarek now, who will now talk a little bit more about possible solutions we could find to what's going on. So fire away, Knarek.
Thank you, Ulrike. Thank you very much. I want also to thank the Association for the Study of Nationalities for this virtual platform to talk and discuss these types of important issues. I also want to thank my colleagues for presenting both the historical dialogue as well as the current challenges that forcibly displaced women face currently, and continue talking about the issues, or also touching upon the possible remedies that and steps and actions that are required to ease the burden of women, as well as enable their integration, or let's say even reintegration. As mentioned by Gohar, and economic issues, namely finding a job, are one of the main outstanding challenges that women face after the displacement. And while talking about overcoming mechanisms, it's important to take into consideration varying situations and needs of women. For example, marital status, number of children, traumas, the place of displacement, and many other factors must be taken into consideration while offering socioeconomic support. The labor market in Armenia is highly competitive, and many forcibly displaced women, unfortunately, as already mentioned, don't have enough capacity to fit the job profiles that are offered average or higher income. And in some cases, and in many cases, we see that many women end up having low paid or unregistered jobs, which don't provide enough level of, life with dignity. Consequently, what we should do is we need to provide trainings, workshops, reprofiling trainings and workshops, and other learning opportunities to these women. And also, so small businesses can also be a solution in this situation. Childcare also restricts, of course, women's mobility, as we understand, and this is especially a very huge issue for single mothers. And I saw that there was a question why women arrive without their breadwinner, because they're either dead or killed during the war, or they went missing, or maybe women are divorced, or maybe they the husbands are still in the front line, so they need to continue taking care after their families and provide the bread in emergency and war circumstances, which obviously endangers, first of all, the physical security of women. So talking about women with children, or like about single mothers, the provision of children's rooms at bigger organizations and different settings could be a solution, and also adjusting the working hours of kindergartens can also serve as a mitigation strategy for this issue, for these issues. And obviously, the economic support should be combined with psychological healing, because in many instances we see that women are frustrated, frightened so much that they don't even want to take over some job obligation or to go out from their comfort zones. And the first step towards the solution of this very important, very urgent issue is the recognition of women's fragile economic situation. We already talked about gender-based violence, domestic violence, and sexual violence cases that are not a few new phenomenon for patriarchal societies, and Armenia is not an exception in this regard. However, if we are talking about gender-based violence and domestic violence, we need to take into consideration that in emergency situations, the cases of violences increase. They have the tendency to increase. This is on one hand. On the other hand, what we see on ground, that in many instances, gender-based violence survivors, they either don't recognize the violence or do not prioritize it in the face of harsh socioeconomic circumstances. It is very crucial to strengthen the Institute of Social Workers and have focal points, especially in compact shelters, to monitor the situation and register the cases, and of course to take preventive measures, especially when we are talking about sexual violence. Another remedy would be to provide gender education to women, young women, women with children, as well as make legal and psychological support, of course, available for them. And it's notable that women's organizations are doing huge work towards this. But as I mentioned, as in many cases, there is a lack of resources, and also women fail to recognize the violence. The cases of violences are going unreported and unaddressed. Because of the prolonged armed conflict, and many women are double or triple displaced, and they have seen 2 wars, numerous escalations, and experienced human losses. This causes not just one, but multiple traumas that require long-term healing, obviously. As we have observed during the second during and after the second Nagorno-Karabakh war, and now women do not prioritize psychological support. And why it happens? consequence because they have different justification. Even if offered, they refuse this support. And why it is happening, and as I mentioned, it's happening through different justifications. And the first one is, of course, they don't take it seriously and don't recognize that they have trauma and don't prioritize their own needs. On the other hand, they always say that they don't have enough time for these secondary things because they have childcare, family care, responsibilities, etc. Nevertheless, we shouldn't give up. Of course, we need to continue creating and offering trauma healing to especially those who have human losses. There is a need of recruiting new psychologists who can work with war trauma and in emergency situations. We need mobile psychological support to also reach those that live in the regions where we really see a lack of psychologists who can work with those who were directly affected by wars, forced displacement, and other consequences of the war. It is also important to create and disseminate audiovisuals on how to approach people with traumas or post-traumatic disorder. It is crucially important to offer psychological support to combatants for their well-being. Obviously, in houses, combatants and people, and especially males with disabilities, their care is mostly on the shoulders of women, which is an extra burden in this already crisis situation. And as reported, and in many instances, this type of care is accompanied also with the gender-based violence against women. Talking about psychological support, it's also important to talk about the support for the frontliners, very much needed, who are dealing with these types of cases, who are providing the first support, who also need to have mental and psychological well-being. So psychosocial support and psychological support, first of all, is very crucial for them as well. There are reported cases also of torture and body mutilations. During the field trips, we were also informed about rape cases that people in their testimonials were talking about this. However, as we don't have focal points in Nagorno-Karabakh, and it is hard to develop evidence-based reporting on this, we can't talk about concrete numbers as of now. It is worth mentioning that also our ombudsman, Anahit Manasyan, talks about this issue quite often. The creation of crisis centers and fact-finding mechanisms are very important to register, respond to war crimes, and later seek justice for the victims. When what we also have registered is that there is an overall lack of understanding of gender dimensions of emergency situations. And not to repeat, because Gohar in detail really represented this, it is very important to consult and engage our women's organizations, gynecologists, social workers, and gender experts for recommendation for their expertise while developing long-term humanitarian support for displaced women. It is of high importance to also recognize that Armenian women living in Nagorno-Karabakh and those living in Armenia have differences. They have different war experiences, life experiences, different settlements, different level of access to different types of resources. And to fill the gap, we need to launch dialogue among local Armenian women and women displaced from Nagorno-Karabakh. We all understand that 9-month blockade, of course, exacerbated all these challenges already facing women. And as my last point, I want to sum up everything by mentioning the need to mainstream the idea of human security in all strategies, policies, and development plans that are created at the governmental level. In this way, we can really have gender-sensitive and gender-responsive mechanisms, policies, and obviously the implementation will also have higher level efficiency, and in the end we will have better results. So I will stop here and I will be happy to answer questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Knari. That was obviously a lot of details to take in to find solutions for the complex situation. Now we got the insight from how displacement affects women and the history of displacement as well. Our last panelist, Lawrence, will talk a little more about the crisis of leadership amongst Armenian Karabakh Armenians. And I hand over to you, Lawrence.
Great, thank you very much, Ulrika. Thank you for the invitation to speak on this panel, which is timely for me personally. I've just come back from 10 days in Armenia. So the other panelists have spoken about the humanitarian concerns, the issues that women in particular face, the general uncertainty that the Karabakh Armenian community is now confronting. And this is certainly where people are at right now. The shock and the trauma are still extremely raw. Nevertheless, in my comments, I would like to reflect on some of the political implications of the mass displacement beyond the immediate humanitarian, gender-based and socio-economic concerns that are now rightly the center of attention. I want to acknowledge that discussing some of the political implications can feel uncomfortable at a time when there is great human suffering and a natural urge to emphasize solidarity and unity. But I think it's still important to reflect on some of these political implications because they will, in any case, affect the lives and trajectories of all of those who've been displaced. So as Jo alluded to in her presentation, Armenia in recent years has been a destination for several waves of population movement that have, to a greater or lesser extent, been caused by force majeure factors. Armenians fleeing the Syrian civil war, Armenians who migrated from Lebanon after the Beirut blast in 2020, and Russians who relocated to Armenia after the invasion of Ukraine are all examples. But the mass displacement of Karabakh Armenians to the Republic of Armenia is fundamentally different in that it represents a significant reordering of Armenia's political contours. And specifically, it forces an encounter between the two visions of Armenia that have dominated the country's independence period. One of these visions is defined by the country's de jure borders, the values that came to be expressed in the 2018 Velvet Revolution, and which are now associated with Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, and through him, with the first leadership of independent Armenia to openly challenge Russia. The other vision has been defined by a wider ethnic space encompassing Armenia and Karabakh and the ambition to unify the two, and has been associated with Armenia's former political elite, now opposition, structured around the Republican Party of Armenia and the country's former presidents of Karabakh Armenian origin, Robert Kocharyan and Serge Sargsyan, and through them associated with a position that foregrounds the necessity of friendly relations with Russia, if not more. This means that questions around the future of the Karabakh Armenian population are intertwined with understandings of the priorities for Armenian statehood and indeed the future of Armenian statehood in and of itself, and perceptions of government opposition dynamics. And this is manifested in painful feelings amongst some of the displaced population of being perceived as a threat to the political status quo in Armenia. So among many Karabakh Armenians, prior feelings of alienation and hostility towards Nikol Pashinyan due to perceptions that he has encouraged narratives emphasizing the cost of the Karabakh issue to Armenia and that without it, finally Armenia can flourish, are being augmented by their experiences in displacement. So a woman was telling me last week that when she goes to the market now in Martuni, she's asked by locals, why don't you like our leader, our prime minister? I also heard anger that the status issue, the status of the displaced community has been left hanging for as long as 5 weeks, and a sense that the government won't mind if refugees leave for Russia, as this might be seen as relieving tensions or the consolidation of oppositional forces. But compounding this sense of alienation is a deep crisis of confidence in the Karabakh Armenians' own leadership, namely the de facto authorities who led the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. There is a strong sense of abandonment and a narrative that the de facto officials failed to manage the outflow of people from the 24th of September. So I heard a lot of anger at the contrast between the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic's performance of statehood, featuring a full complement of state institutions, ministries, and so on, and its actual performance in the September catastrophe, when the popular narrative is that after the 20th of September, the community was effectively left to fend for itself without active management or announcements coming from the leadership. And some of this anger has been expressed in protests at the permanent representation of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic in Yerevan in recent weeks. And this question of Karabakh Armenian leadership is made more complex by the fragmentation of the prior elite. 3 former de facto presidents are imprisoned in Azerbaijan, along with Ruben Vardanyan, awaiting trial. And their fate will be keenly observed in Armenia, not least because if released, they may return as heroes to Armenia. Other figures, however, associated with other factions who lost out in internal struggles in Nagorno-Karabakh were allowed to pass into Armenia, such as the former de facto Minister of Defense, Samvel Babayan, and former Security Council Chief and presidential candidate, Vitaly Balasanyan. Babayan has been vocal in national media since his arrival, criticizing the previous leadership now imprisoned in Azerbaijan and claiming he could have secured a more advantageous agreement with Baku on the status of the Karabakh Armenians. Few people believe that, yet Babayan's claims indicate a readiness to leverage the situation to promote new political careers in Armenia. And as many people conveyed to me in Yerevan last week, people like Babayan are seen as extremely dangerous actors for Armenia's politics. So consequently, beyond the horizon of immediate humanitarian and socio-economic needs, there is the question of legitimate Karabakh Armenian leadership. At the moment, it appears unlikely that this leadership would take the form of a government in exile. There is resistance from the government of Armenia to such an idea, for whom it could represent an internal political risk. There's resistance from Azerbaijan, and the crisis in legitimacy amongst the Karabakh Armenian population itself that I have outlined. But ultimately, a legitimate leadership for the Karabakh Armenian population will be needed, apart from anything else, in order to negotiate a host of outstanding issues with the Azerbaijani state, including the fate of cultural heritage, property issues, the potential for visits to the territory, and potentially at some future date, perhaps in a different political context that we cannot now foresee, discussion of the right of return. So just to highlight that beyond these immediate socio-economic and humanitarian concerns, which are rightly the focus, there lie these longer-term issues around leadership for the displaced community. And I stop there.
Thank you, Lawrence. That was very interesting. And obviously it gives a slightly different perspective what people think like being affected by displacement and who to believe and what to do next. So we have had already a couple of questions. One is specifically long, and it kind of, I'm not actually sure whether our panel can answer this, because at the moment a lot of data is still very blurry and not quite recorded as it should be, but there were a couple like kind of hinting at demographics. But the first question, which is really interesting, and I don't know whether some of the presenters can actually answer the question: what is Armenia's current capacity for absorption of all these displaced people, more than 100,000? Stating that while the labor market, housing market, education, healthcare and social service systems may struggle to accommodate such a large influx of people. The primary concern may be the emotional capacity of Armenian society. Armenia has prior experience with displacement dating back to the early 1990s during the initial cycle of conflict when people fled from Azerbaijan proper. So the question is, does the panel believe that over the years, especially after the events of 2020, Armenian society has developed a stronger emotional capacity to constructively absorb these new ways of displacement? And what measures need to be taken to enhance this capacity, and what are the primary challenges you see in this regard? So I wonder who would like to start first. Maybe Knarik or Goha would like to say something about that.
I can start and Gohar can continue in this regard. So yeah, this is a multi-layered question, and obviously to answer it, I need a longer time, but I will try to really be as precise as possible. So talking about like really being able to integrate these people, welcome them, host them, and provide sheltering and housing. I would say that the capacities are limited, and I don't think that this is a secret, and there is a huge support coming from European Union and many other countries to really support this process of absorption and reintegration of this really huge amount of people. But here I want to also touch upon another issue that as of now we have, and it can also again explain the situation. We have refugees, the first generation refugees, even from first Nagorno-Karabakh war in 2019. After quite a long period of silence, new measures have been taken to reintegrate and provide housing to first generation of refugees. But as of now, we even have the problem of even integrating and first generation refugees into the society and to provide life with dignity. So the capacities are limited, and it is happening quite, I would say, slow, and this will take time. And to say that we have developed this emotional capacity to also withstand all this somehow would be wrong, because if we are talking about psychological support, etc., but the reality is that many people have this very bad emotional situation, or not feeling quite secure in here. And I would even say those that are forcibly displaced in Armenia, even here, that they don't feel safe. And to add what I was saying about the economic situation, etc., I observed cases when people were reluctant to even search for jobs because they thought that it's not safe to stay in Armenia, and they're looking forward to finding a third country for living. If this might be an answer to your question.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Maybe Goha, do you want to add something?
No, I think Narik quite comprehensively presented it, and I think, that there is a capacity to absorb people, but the thing is, I think the problem is how to manage all that and organize it, and I think it's more of a question of organization and management rather than having capacities or not, because in the regions especially there are quite empty houses, spaces that people can live, and these people used to live to work in the fields, and they mainly do agricultural work, so they can work for them. The thing is how it can be easily and efficiently organized now.
Yep. Just to say, the audience, keep adding your questions to our question chat. We hopefully can get through to them all. Just to say, there was the question about why do many women arrive to Armenia without a breadwinner. Just to say, Knarik in her presentation has already referred to this question, so I hope this is answered as well. There is now a specific question for Lawrence. Has Russia played any role lately, or is it totally distracted by this war in Ukraine? Presumably, is there any help coming from Russia for refugees? Probably this would the question involve. So Lawrence, if you wanted to say a few words.
Sure. Well, it's a wide-ranging question. I would argue that Russia is going through a process of managed decline in the South Caucasus that stems in very large part from its disastrous war in Ukraine. And what we've seen is effectively the abandonment of a policy to avoid choosing between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Karabakh conflict. And we've seen the standing down of its peacekeeping forces, and indeed, in many senses, a humiliation of its peacekeeping mission. Several of Russian peacekeepers were actually killed during the one-day war in September. The narrative that is very prevalent in Armenia, at least, is that it is Russia that is now the champion of this transit route covering the southern part of Armenia, the so-called Zangezur corridor, as it's referred to in Azerbaijan and Turkey. So there is this sense that Russia is looking for ways to remain embedded in the region through transit infrastructure, but it's effectively lost its role as a peacekeeper and as a protector of the Karabakh Armenian population. And I think this is very significant in the sense that, there's been a lot of speculation about anger directed at Nikol Pashinyan for his, mismanagement, alleged mismanagement of the conflict, and that might lead to his being vulnerable. That is in a way counterbalanced by a very deep-seated anger that I also perceived amongst Karabakh Armenians last week that is directed towards Russia. And I think what's really interesting here, and I don't have answers as to why this happened, but why did Russia allow the former de facto presidents and Ruben Vardanyan to be captured by Azerbaijan? It would have been possible for Russia to airlift those individuals out of Karabakh. And I think that's particularly interesting in the context of the fact that, Aray Harutyunyan was loyal to Vladimir Putin. There was recognition of the so-called People's Republics in eastern Ukraine. There was the display of the large Z motif in Karabakh. Aid was sent to the Russian side of the Ukraine war from Karabakh. So, there were these demonstrations of loyalty, and yet this loyalty was not repaid. Instead, we've seen videos of the former leaders of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic sort of being led away to their prison cells. So I think that's a kind of, fascinating, outcome in terms of, for Vladimir Putin, that shows that his clients are not necessarily going to be protected. So that's a kind of anomaly. I don't have an answer as to why that happened, but in general, the answer to your question is yes, Russia is distracted, but even a weakened Russia is a hugely powerful actor in the South Caucasus.
Okay, thank you, Lawrence. There is kind of the first. This was. I hope your answer was detailed enough about Russia's role. But coming back to the question in the audience about what measures need to be taken to enhance capacity to absorb this new wave of migration into Armenia, or this wave of displacement into Armenia. Perhaps, Joe, what could you say as a historian that how can we, you talked about the different waves of displacement in the Caucasus, and how do you think lessons from the past could help to kind of find a better capacity or better mechanism of absorption for these new displacement, for this new wave of displacement? Could like lessons from history actually feed into current refugee policy?
Thanks, Ulrika. I think what we see when people write the history of humanitarianism and refugees is not so much direct lessons from the past. It's really hard to transpose something, you know, a situation in 1915 onto the present. But we do see a kind of a need to kind of, I guess, critically examine, to unpack what is taken for granted. So ideas about, for example, altruism or the universality or the neutrality of humanitarianism, and look at the different politics which shape relief on the ground. The other thing I think that comes out of histories of humanitarianism is a really clear sense that in past episodes of displacement in Armenia and elsewhere, what refugees, what the displaced themselves want, what they need, how they see their futures, is often erased, even by the most kind of well-intentioned, most well-intentioned humanitarian or state actors who kind of harness refugees for visions of their own visions of what the future should look like, whether that's a state vision, whether that's a patriarchal vision, whatever. So I think that kind of need to listen, and how you facilitate that, I don't know, but it sounds like both Gohar and Nahrika are involved in really kind of in-depth efforts to do that. That's really important. And I think the word absorb here is interesting, because I don't know whether absorbing is what we kind of need to see, or whether it's more a case of maybe people will want to move on, and how do we give people chances to kind of shape their futures in their own way. And I think the other thing about kind of emotional capacity is what we see in the past, and I can think of one example actually from the records of I think it was the Armenian Central Committee in 1915 in the Caucasus, where they talk about this is refugees even before the arrival of the refugees from Van. They talk about how the local villages have played the most important role. They provided Armenians with a corner of their homes, they provided bread, etc. But they're running out of money themselves. There were women being left on their own when their husbands are going to the front. There are people coming back from the war injured, and they just don't have the economic capacity, and that's what shapes the sort of willingness to take on and assist refugees. And there is that kind of, I guess, that what is familiar to us as compassion fatigue, where people start out with the best of intentions, but if the structures aren't there, which Gohar talked about, and the organization isn't there, the best of intentions, the kind of right emotions, if I can put it that way, don't help that much in the long term.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That was really helpful. Can the audience, you still can post question in the Q&A section if you like. There's another question, probably more for Gohar, and we have talked already a lot of the different sides and challenges of displacement from a historical perspective, from Lawrence talked about lack of leadership, Narek talked about the solutions, but I wonder the audience wonder, what are the main challenges women's organizations face, like the frontline workers who you have mentioned trauma so much, and we know that a lot of Nagorno-Karabakh people, Armenian from Nagorno-Karabakh, have triple trauma, double trauma from all these different war scenarios. So how is the situation for frontline workers? There's some great volunteerism going, helping support to solve the situation, but what are do they get any emergency support in terms of dealing with the stories they hear and so on?
Thank you, Ulrika. Really very important question, in my opinion, because this is what happened prior to this event of this September. Let me go a little bit back, because when we started to work with women's organizations in 2003, 2005, they were still emerging organizations. But then what happened is, I'm sure you know, everywhere in the world we have this anti-gender, anti-human rights groups that were also attacking women's organizations severely in Armenia as well. And there were huge smear campaigns against women's organizations. There were a lot of blackmailing and court cases against women's organizations, accusing them of destroying families, etc. So women's organizations and frontline, especially those working with domestic violence cases, sexual harassment, etc., they arrived firstly to COVID-19 crisis already quite traumatized and in a very bad mental health and financial and in any capacity very bad situation. They arrived to this crisis of COVID, and then the war of 2020 happened, and then after that the whole 9 months of blockade that they were trying also to do their best to help people in Nagorno-Karabakh, and now this ethnic cleansing that happened. So women's organizations, and not only but mainly, but also frontline workers such as psychologists, social workers, there were already in quite a long standing trauma when this event happened. And now we can see that they're working basically 24/7 to help displaced population, and many of them are just not they can't bear this burden anymore. And for us as a Women's Fund and people who also worry about this situation, we really think that it's very, very important to develop special programs for them also, along with, special trauma healing. And as Knarik was mentioning, this, psychological support to the displaced population, and to increase their resilience. We were speaking about barriers. This is also one of the things that organizations, they are quite resilient, but really some programs on resilience, organizational resilience, psychosocial resilience is very much needed to endure these ongoing multiple crises all the time.
Okay, thank you.
If I may add, Ulrike.
Yes, go
yeah.
for it.
Yeah, thank you, and sorry for interrupting. I actually want to continue with the conversation regarding especially about the psychological trauma healing process, and address also the questions how we are going to do that. So generally, when we are talking about psychosocial support and especially psychological support, people envision a scenario when one person sits in front of the other one and there is a consultation happening, and obviously you need to drag the person into this conversation, convince, etc. But talking about what we can do also to observe this, the huge amount of people into these processes and engage in psychological trauma healing processes, there are numerous new methodologies, and I want to mention the storytelling method as one of the most important things, like asking people how they feel and what they think and what they think should be done to really support them to overcome their trauma. This can be individual, this can be group storytelling, which proved to be very very helpful and very engaging for women. Also, there are like some other methods like art therapies, which are very attractive, especially for children. And our experience is also showing that women who lost their husbands, for example, and refused even talk, they really started started attending these art therapies, and as a result, they also started their own entrepreneurships, because during these art therapies, they gained some skills, and they started also using on their own benefit from the point of their social well-being. So I was also talking about starting a dialogue and launching a dialogue between the same nation but with different backgrounds. And obviously this is very happening in a very bringing them together, creating a trustful environment, explaining the differences, but not ourselves, but giving the opportunity to these attendees to explain themselves and present their life stories. Because one thing that I want to mention in here, that there is sometimes a very not in many cases, but we see cases when people show some negative attitude to these assigned privileges to displaced people, because there is a failure to explain the war trauma, there is the failure to explain the experiences that these forcibly displaced people have, being directly affected by the war. And there is an important thing to create a platform for these people so they can speak up and talk their experiences and being visible in all these geopolitical chaos. So I wanted to also add this. Thank you.
Thank you, Gnari. And I think Joe wanted to ask or add a question about what we just discussed. Am I right?
Yeah, sorry, I think I might have typed it in the wrong box. But I just wanted to ask to see if I could kind of connect what Lawrence and Gohar and Narek were discussing in that I wondered if there was a sense that relief and responsibility for relief of refugees was being caught up in political agendas already. You know, Lawrence talked about the distinctions between, or the fractures in the leadership of Karabakh Armenians, and critiques of the state, of the Armenian state, and vice versa. And I just wondered if this was kind of becoming explicitly politicized, or if there were kind of different groups that had different, were trying to kind of mobilize relief for kind of different political purposes. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Lawrence, do you want to quickly add something, or?
I mean, I alluded in my comments to, the politicization of the situation by some of the factions from the former Karabakh Armenian leadership, in the sense of, claiming that a different outcome was possible had they been listened to. The fate of the Karabakh Armenian community and the notion of return is also, of course, implicated in a number of external agendas. A Russian presence in Karabakh was predicated on the presence of Karabakh Armenians to be, protected by a Russian peacekeeping mission. So, there is discussion that there is a Russian incentive to see perhaps some kind of symbolic return. There's also arguments out there that might be in Azerbaijan's interest in order to offset or counter claims of ethnic cleansing, if it facilitates the return, again, perhaps of a symbolic population. Those claims would be less convincing. And of course, for Western actors, there's deep embarrassment, shame, I think, amongst a lot of the Western policymakers, that particularly those who made assurances in advance of September that such an outcome would be unacceptable. But I think we see different geopolitical agendas here. I think there are also going to be, immense normative pressures to talk about return. But I think we need to see that connected to actual political realities and practical realities on the ground. In the current situation, I think any returnees in any direction are going to be seen as a kind of fifth column for a hostile irredentist power. So I think, you know, we need to see really quite substantial transformations in the broader interstate context between Armenia and Azerbaijan before we could talk about return as something really plausible and viable. And in terms of you know, the priorities as identified by those I was speaking to in Armenia over these last 10 days, one primary concern is the absence of any centralized data source with information as to where the Karabakh Armenians actually are in Armenia. So a need to map the population and how they can be informed about their status, their rights, and what the implications are of the status choice that they have, whether to become refugees or whether to accept a full Armenian citizenship. The sense that I got is that, you know, in terms of dialogue with Azerbaijan, it's still much too early to talk about that. And one sort of message that I got from one group that I spoke to is that for as long as there's a kind of still a euphoria in Azerbaijan, that makes a dialogue very difficult, because it makes sort of a sober reflection on possibilities much more difficult. So yeah, those were some of the priorities as conveyed to me from the ground in Armenia.
Thank you, Lawrence. I think we have to wrap it up now. Or Shusha, we just got another question from the audience, and I wonder, is there a chance we could potentially, everyone, to conclude the discussion, give a quick answer? Basically, oh sorry, I missed it. What do you think as panelists, whether this mass displacement of Karabakh Armenians should be characterized as ethnic cleansing? If you could keep your answer very brief, but just give a final comment and then we wrap it up. Thank you, Shusha, for your patience. Sorry about that. Who wants to start? Knarik, maybe you want to quickly say something?
Okay, so keeping the nation in 1 month blockade without caring what is happening with the nation, with thousands of people, without caring what is happening with pregnant people with different diseases, not having access to medical help because there is no fuel and no one can help you, not having access to pharmacies because there is nothing to find in the pharmacies, without having access to education because how you can reach there is no electricity, etc. You can't warm yourself, prepare food, there is no bread, and you need to pay for example $20 per kilogram for sugar, and then being attacked and also being kept in a fear of being physically destroyed, which we saw because of the mass influx. So these are the reasons why it is also called ethnic cleansing.
Okay, thank you, Knarik. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I just can add to all what Knarik said, the severe level of Armenophobia in Azerbaijan for many years already, and portraying Armenians as just really like dehumanizing and portraying as all the time as enemies that should be also destroyed, or they should be kicked out of the region, etc. So all this the rhetoric also played its role in why, because people are wondering why in 48 hours, basically more than 100,000 people left, if there was no, they weren't under threat of being killed immediately, But we have to understand the whole propaganda, and also we have to watch all the Aliyev sponsored Telegram channels that were doing really, really, playing a huge role in all that, because the way Armenians are portrayed on these channels. All these atrocities that are videos, videos of atrocities are posted. This is all played its role in that's why it's ethnic cleansing. That's why it should be called ethnic cleansing.
Okay, Joe, but keep it short, and then Lawrence finally, and then we conclude. Joe.
Sorry. I think it's important to say that, I'm a historian and I'm not a legal scholar, and historians and lawyers use those categories differently, but it seems like the fitting term to me, and I would agree with what Knarik and Gohar have just said. I have no cause to not.
Yeah. Lawrence, do you want to add something to what we discussed, or in terms
sure.
of the question? Yeah.
Look, I think we should recognize that there's always been a narrative that people left voluntarily in all the waves of displacement that have taken place since the late 1980s, but many of those who were displaced in the 1980s and early 1990s, where we freely refer to ethnic cleansing, actually experienced less direct coercion than the Karabakh Armenians who were displaced earlier this year. If you look at the developments, between the 24th of September and for that following week, you can find a sort of plausibly deniable process. You've got photos of Azerbaijani soldiers distributing water and so on. But if you look at the longer trajectory of the preceding 10 months, of course, you're seeing coercion and intimidation being used to force a population out. And it's not only about the blockade, it's about lorries encircling Karabakh Armenian villages with loudspeakers calling on people to leave, shots being fired at agricultural workers. So, it is a complex process. And I think, unfortunately, this is another instance of ethnic cleansing in the South Caucasus. And it is a long-term process. If we see that Armenian cultural heritage is denationalized in Karabakh, then we would see the completion of this process, which would be just another tragedy to successive waves of ethnic cleansing ongoing, as Jo highlighted in her presentation, since the early 20th century.
Thank you, Lauren. So that's it for us now. Sorry for going on a bit longer. I think we have answered most of the questions. So I'll pass it to you on Shusha.
Thank you. Well, thank you for going on a little bit longer, because this has really been an amazingly comprehensive and insightful conversation. It's not easy to provide both perspective on past and current political and social components and power dynamics, and also including highlighting the significance of local actors, but also Russia, and a similarly important perspective on the everyday traumas on the ground, so to speak. And I'm sure many of us have appreciated the way, the gender lens, the significance of the gender lens was highlighted. And I was thinking that this is understudied when we talk about, especially in political science, when we talk about migration and displacement. It's almost like an afterthought, but there is no not much or not sufficient sustained discussion of it. And I know that these scholars here, also including Ulrike, have focused on it and have really contributed greatly. And also the discussion about the psychological aspects of healing after collective displacement and how that features in integration is something that, you're talking about Armenian displacement, but as a comparativist, I'm also thinking about the other processes and traumas of displacement that go on, and those that happened, what Brubaker called the ethnic mixing and unmixing of populations as part of nation building and nationalizing, and what happened after World War II. And so this apparently is something that we don't learn enough about to stop doing to each other. And on that happy note, Thank you very much, and thank you to those of you who have been here. And please remember that the conversation, as other virtual ESN expert conversations, is going to be archived and will be available on the virtual ESN website for viewing, downloading, using in teaching. And please stay with us, come back to our next event about which you will be receiving an announcement relatively soon. Take care and good evening. Thank you to those of you who have stayed with us in a different time zone. It's nighttime for you, and let's continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.